Hi, my name is Mariam. Today we're going to take a look at the first chapter of the 0470 Cambridge IGCSE option B, which is Modern History syllabus. Um, so were the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923 fair? In this video, we're going to take a look at the big three at the Paris Peace Conference, the conference itself, the big three players, and the treaties that arose from their meeting after World War One. So let's go. So the aims of the big three at Versailles. The general opinion after World War One was that Germany had caused the war and needed to be punished. In Great Britain and France, the total number of killed and injured was over 9 million people. The big three were the Allies, Britain, France, and the USA. The victorious powers were going to meet at the Palace of Versailles in France to discuss the terms of peace after World War One and the punishment that was to be inflicted on Germany and the Central Powers. The conference would last from 1919 to 1920. It was headed by the leaders of the Big Three, David Lloyd George, George Clemenceau, and Woodrow Wilson. The three differed considerably in their aims of punishing Germany. So, the aims and motives of France. France had suffered the most during the war. Almost all of the war had been fought in France. A farming area the size of Wales had been completely destroyed. 750,000 French homes were destroyed. 2 million people were homeless. 1.5 million Frenchmen were dead, and twice that number were wounded. The war led to the destruction of railways, roads, bridges, and factories, all of which needed rebuilding. Thus, Clemenceau, a man affectionately nicknamed Father Victory, was determined that Germany would be made to pay the cost of the war. Let's take a look at him. He was the Prime Minister of France from 1917 to 1920. He was an older politician, and he could remember the devastating humiliation brought to France during the Franco-Prussian War that lasted from 1870 to 1871 and saw the territory of Alsace-Lorraine being captured by the Germans. France had been forced to pay Germany 5 billion francs in reparations, and the German military occupied parts of France until the amount was paid in full. Clemenceau was determined to entirely cripple Germany with the treaty. He needed to ensure France's political security and that it would never be invaded by Germany again. The aims and motives of Great Britain. Britain was not as severely affected by the war as France, however, it did pay an enormous cost. The war cost Britain about 5,700,000 pounds a day. 3/4 of a million British soldiers died fighting. I think the exact number was 886,000 men. Twice that amount were severely wounded. In 4 years, Britain had spent about 9 billion pounds on the war, and this was funded through loans from the USA. The sum of 1 billion pounds needed to be paid back as soon as possible. Britain was represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of Britain from 1916 to 1920. He was under immense pressure from the British public. They had been fed anti-German propaganda for 4 years, and they saw how Germany had treated Russia upon its surrender in 1980 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk stripped Russia hugely of its agricultural and industrial land and removed about 25% of its population. World War One allies interpreted this as a blueprint for what Germany would have done to them had they won the war. The British public also suffered huge food shortages. Income tax had risen from 60 pence to 30 pence to cover the cost of the war. Now, Lloyd George was a realist. He wanted Germany and Britain to become trade partners again. Germany had been Britain's largest exporter of coal pre-World War One. However, he knew that a harsh treaty would also make the Germans want to seek revenge and thus lead to a communist revolution. His fears proved to be true, as we shall see. However, he did need to weaken Germany to, one, appease the British public, and two, ensure that Germany lost its naval and its colonies that threatened Britain's supremacy overseas. The aims and the motives of the USA. The USA had entered the war in 1917, and American Yanks had only arrived in Europe during spring of 1918. Remember that the armistice took place on the 11th of November 1918. The war had never really came to America. It intervened on the side of the Allies when Germany was at the brink of defeat. Hence, Woodrow Wilson arrived at Paris in 1918 with no scores to settle, but some damage had been inflicted. 116,000 American soldiers had perished, and the American public pushed for a policy of isolationism, meaning the USA needed to remove itself from the self-destructive affairs of the old world, in which it had, it didn't need to involve itself in things outside of the USA. So, Woodrow Wilson, he was the Democrat president of the United States from 1913 to 1921. He was obstinate at the conference. He refused to cancel the debt owed to him by Britain and the Allies. This effectively pressured them into accepting his controversial ideas. He had four main objectives at the conference. One, don't be too harsh on Germany. They especially deserved punishment, but extremist groups like the communists might exploit resentment to seize power, like they did during the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Number two, strengthen democracy in defeated nations like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey to avoid war. Number three, give self-determination to smaller countries, part of former empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And number four, instill international cooperation by the 14 points. Let's take a look at what those were. Okay, so these are his points summarized. You don't need to learn all of them. I've only highlighted the points that I thought are, most important to the syllabus. Number one, no secret treaties, like the 1915 Treaty of London that had bribed Italy into joining the side of the Allies by promising lands off the coast of Greece and possession of the Adriatic coast in the Balkans. Number two, set up a League of Nations that would govern the affairs of Europe and the entire world, and by instilling cooperation and encouraging countries to not isolate themselves so that war would not happen. And number three, all countries must work to disarmament. So no more arms races, no more being suspicious of other countries and what their military operations are. So the Paris Peace Conference took place at the historic Palace of Versailles. It lasted 12 months. 32 nations were supposed to be represented, but none of the defeated nations were invited. Remember that Germany was surrendered unconditionally, therefore they had no say at the talks. Five main treaties were drawn up. All important decisions on the fate of Germany were made by the Big Three. The Big Three were supported by a huge array of diplomats and expert advisors, but they often ignored their advice. So there were other victors, namely Italy and Japan, but I think they're less relevant to the syllabus. However, you should have a general understanding of what they were hoping to achieve at the conference. So Italy had entered the war in 1950 via bribery in the Treaty of London and suffered a 460,000 soldier casualties. Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando came to the conference expecting the land and reparations as promised to them. Japan had supported the Allies and also expected a sort of reward. They wanted Manchuria specifically, plus German colonies in China and the Pacific. Now let's take a look at Germany. Germany had suffered a major defeat. It lost 2 million men by 1918. Its factories, farms, and mines were exhausted by supplying the army. Britain's naval blockade had prevented food from reaching Germany. Britain did this because they wanted to ensure that Germany could not restart the war. Inflation rose to the point where a wheelbarrow full of money could not buy a single newspaper. So the first treaty we're going to look at is the Treaty of Versailles, which dealt with Germany. It was signed on the 28th of June, 1919. German delegates were forbidden from attending any of the meetings, but they had been shown the terms in May of that year. They were horrified as they believed that the terms would be based on Wilson's 14 points that advocated for things like self-determination for free peoples. They had considered restarting the war, but this was virtually impossible. So what were the terms of the Treaty of Versailles? You need to know these. So the first term was land. Germany would lose 10% of her land. Alsace-Lorraine would be returned to France. Land would be given to Belgium, Denmark, and Czechoslovakia. The Polish corridor was created to give the new country Poland a way to the Baltic, effectively severing Germany in two. The second term was colonies. All German colonies would be taken away and given to Britain and France under the League of Nations mandates until they were ready for independence. Armed forces conscription was banned. Germany's navy was reduced to just 6 ships. No tanks, airplanes, or submarines were allowed. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized. That meant no soldiers or military equipment could be kept within 30 miles east of the east bank of the river. The Allies would occupy this area for 15 years until 1935. The Saar was to be occupied for 15 years, and France would be able to mine coal in the area during that time. Reparations. Germany had to pay the cost of the war. This sum was worked out in 1921 to come to 6,600 million pounds, and this would be paid for the rest of the 20th century. The war guilt clause was Clause 251. Germany had to accept blame for the war alone. But the victors did not get what they wanted. For France, they couldn't occupy the Rhineland because Lloyd George believed this would only antagonize the Germans. The USA, Wilson was not able to achieve freedom of the seas as mentioned in his 14 points because Lloyd George wanted to maintain British naval supremacy. Britain, Lloyd George was unable to achieve a moderate settlement because of anti-German public sentiment in Britain and France. He was forced to accept harsher terms for Germany than he would have liked. The Italians were not given the Adriatic coast as promised because Woodrow did not agree to the creation of an Italian empire. Japan was not allowed to occupy Manchuria, however, it was given former German colonies in China. The second treaty was the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which dealt with Austria. It was signed in September 1919. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was officially broken up. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Poland were declared to be independent nations. Austria was given Eastern Galicia, the Trentino, South Tyrol, Trieste, and Istria. The army was limited to 30,000 men. Reparations had to be paid for the span of 30 years, and the union of Austria and Germany, Anschluss, was forbidden except with the express permission of the Council of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Trianon dealt with Hungary, and it was signed in June 1920, but it was delayed for more than a year because of a war between Hungary and its neighbors. Hungary lost 3/4 of its population and 2/3 of its population. Sorry, 3/4 of its territory and 2/3 of its population. The army was limited to 35,000 men. Slovakia was given to Czechoslovakia, and Western Hungary was given to Austria. Croatia and Slavonia were given to Yugoslavia. Transylvania was given to Romania, and the Hungarians agreed to pay part of the Austrian reparations. The Treaty of Sèvres dealt with Turkey, and it was signed on August 10th, 1920, but was delayed by a war between Greece and Turkey and invasion by Italy. It effectively dismantled the Ottoman Empire. Turkey's troops were limited to 50,000 men. The Straits were now international. The Turkish tax system and finances were to be controlled by the Allies. The Allies could now station troops in Turkey to ensure that the treaty was followed. These terms were not recognized by the new Turkish government of Mustafa Kemal, who had overtaken power from the Sultan of Turkey. The Treaty of Neuilly dealt with Bulgaria and was signed in November 1919. The Bulgarian army was limited to 20,000 men. Reparations of 100 million pounds were to be paid. They had lost access to the Mediterranean, and Bulgaria lost some land to Yugoslavia and the Adriatic coast to Greece. Now, the last treaty was the Treaty of Lausanne, and it dealt with Turkey. It was signed on July 24th, 1923, as a sort of revision of the Treaty of Sèvres. So Turkey recovered some territory from Greece, but gave up all claims to non-Turkish territory lost during the war. All claims for reparations were dropped. What was the impact of the Treaty of Versailles on Germany? Well, Germany had surrendered unconditionally in November 1918. The politicians who had signed the treaty were called the November criminals by Hitler. Many resented the Treaty of Versailles. They did not believe that the German army was actually defeated because Germany was never invaded. The failed communist revolution by the Spartakists took place in 1919. Germany was forced to build 200,000 tons of shipping for the Allies in the next 5 years. All merchant ships weighing over 1,600 tons were handed over. Large quantities of coal were given to France, Belgium, and Italy in the next 10 years. The Dawes Plan came about because Germany found itself unable to pay the reparations. The new liberal Weimar Republic made its first payment in 1922. It was a sum of 50, yes, it was a sum of 50 million pounds. And but by 1923, it could not give any more money. It stopped coal shipments by January of 1923. France and Belgium resented this. They needed to pay back their debts, so they retaliated by militarizing the Ruhr to sort of intimidate Germany into paying. They intended to force the Germans to hand over coal and iron ore in place of payment. At this point, inflation in Germany had led to money printing. Prices could rise between joining the back of a queue and reaching the front. Savings that in 1921 could be used to buy a house could not buy even a loaf of bread by 1923, and wages began to be paid daily instead of weekly, which is a sign of recession. Some Germans gained from this disaster and paid off huge debts with worthless Reichsmarks, but others were left penniless. The value of money was virtually worthless. Gustav Stresemann tackled hyperinflation by promising to restart reparation payments in order to get France to leave the Ruhr by 1925. So he introduced the Dawes Plan in 1924, and here's why. Reparation payments were set at 1 billion gold marks per year, which he promised would increase to a sum of 2.5 billion. France was also experiencing inflation, and Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, asked US banks to support Germany. Germany itself received a loan of 800 million gold marks. Passive resistance was called off by Gustav Stresemann in September 1923. So basically, that's it for this chapter. I think I've covered all the points that you should know in the exam, but do let me know if you want to see um, the following chapters. I'm more than willing to cover the entire syllabus. I did use this information to get myself an A-star in the exam, so I'd be more than willing to share some tips and tricks to help you out. And yeah.